So Rabosai, we are now on Daf Chav Chesamid Beis, and if you recall, we said that Avram Avinu was able to daven mincha exactly at Chatzos because he was a zaken, and a zaken is someone who has wisdom, v'yoshev b'yeshiva, and he was marba b'yeshiva, meaning a lot of limud Torah, and with that Torah knowledge, he would avoid any sort of mistakes, and he had such great chachma, he would be able to be mechaven exactly at Chatzos to daven mincha. For us, we have a greater tendency to make a mistake, and for the margin of error, we wait an extra half hour. And then Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina had quoted 3 different psukim to prove that in every generation we had Canaan. For example, in the case of the Avos, all 3 of us we said were called Zaken. And then when we were in Mitzrayim, there were also Canaan. And when we left Mitzrayim and entered into the Midbar, also Canaan, 70s Canaan. And Avram is called Zaken, Avram Zaken Baba Yomim. Yitzchak is called Zaken Vayhiki Zkan Yitzchak, and Yaakov is called Zaken. It says, V'enei Yisrael Kovdu Mizaken. Then we said that Eliezer ben Eved Avram was also a Zaken. It says, Ev Avdos Kan Besa. And he soaked up all the Torah from his Rebbe and transmitted it further. Now we got up to a statement of Rav. This is where we got up to yesterday. So let's see if we could all find a place. Omar Rav. It's at the beginning of the wide lines, the second line in the wide lines. Actually, there are 3 sizes. So it's the widest lines, the second of the widest lines. Omar Rav, Kiem Avram Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula. Avram Avinu anticipated somehow the Torah, the entire Torah, Shenemar, because when God comes to console Yitzchak after the death of Avram, he promises Yitzchak that he will fulfill whatever he promised to his father Avram. And why? Because Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koli Vayishmar Mishmarti Mitzvosai V'Chukosai V'Sorosai. That Avram was meticulous about observing the entire mitzvah, the whole gamut, including mitzvos, chukim, and Torahs. The Maharsha wonders, what did Rav add here to what we already know from the Mishnah Kiddushin? Mishnah Kiddushin quotes, Matzinu sha'asa Avram Avinu es kol haTorah kula ad shelo nitna. And the Gemara in Kiddushin derives this from Psukim. Says the Maharsha, there it says Asa Avram, and here it says Kiem Avram. So when it says Asa Avram, then we should derive from that Avram Avinu was Makayim all the mitzvahs essay. That's called Asavram. We don't know for sure if Avram Avinu avoided violating a losasa. Rav says Kiem es kol haTorah kula. Kiem implies both mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs losasa. Amalei Rav Shimi bar Chia l'Rav. The Ema Sheva mitzvos. Okay, the Torah testifies, God testifies that Avram was Mekayim the mitzvos. Maybe it means the 7 mitzvos b'nei Noach. How do you know it means Kol HaTorah Kula? So the Gemara asks, Va'ika nami Mila. Mila is not one of the 7 mitzvos b'nei Noach. No way, no how. And yet Avram Avinu was Mekayim the mitzvah of Mila. So the Gemara says I can deflect that question with ease. Amos Sheva mitzvahs umila. When the pasuk says testifying about Avram these Mekayim the mitzvos, it means Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach plus Mila. Amalei, so Rav says to Rav Simi Bar Chia, Im Kain, if you're going to tell me that mitzvosai means 7 mitzvos plus Mila, is mitzvosai v'sarosai lomali? Why does the pasuk add to mitzvosai sorosai? If Avraham Avinu was only mekayim 7 mitzvos, so what does v'sorosai add to mitzvosai? Why 2 words? It could have just said Shama Avram bikoli v'yishmaris mishparti, and then we would know that Avraham Avinu was mekayim kol Torah kula. So obviously, the extra word torosai is coming to add beyond the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach to establish that Avraham Avinu was mekayim the entire Torah. So that Rav now divides up mitzvosai and torosai into 2 categories. Mitzvosai includes the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach plus Mila, and torosai now alludes to the balance of the mitzvahs, and we end up with 613. Now I have 2 short footnotes that I want to call to your attention here. One is Shama Avram B'Koli Holech Al Kol Ma Shetzivo Hashem B'Asora Hanisyonos. In other words, before it says Vayishmar Mitzvosai V'Sorosai, it says Shama Avram B'Koli. What is that referring to? And he answers that's referring to the Asora Nisyonos, the 10 tests that God tested Abraham. Chukosai, that refers to the mitzvos that don't have a clear rationale, and the Yetzer Hara and the Umas HaOlam try to entice us to drop these mitzvos. They're irrational, or shall we say irrational. And the Maskonas Hasugya is that Mishmarti are the Gzeros and Archokos to the Isurim of the Torah, like Shnias Arayas and Shvus Shabbos. Mitzvosai are those mitzvahs that, if they weren't written in the Torah, they would still be suitable, they'd be worthy, they would be morally correct, like Gezel and Shvichas Domer. And then we get to Chukosai, which refers to mitzvos that have no apparent logic. Omar Rava, Itema Ravashi, Kiem Avram Avinu Afilu Erev Tavshilin. We just finished establishing that when it says Mishmarti in this pasuk in Parshas Vayera describing Avram, it's referring to Harchakos, or Isurim that would later be established by the Chachamim, like Shnios Larayos or Shvus on Shabbos. So the Gemara adds now Erev Tavshilin, which is Takana D'Rabbanan. What's the emphasis here on Erev Tavshilin? You want to say that Avraham Avinu somehow anticipated all the Xeros and all the Takonis of Chazal, and his minig was to fulfill all of them. So why do you emphasize Erev Tavshilin? And you derive it from a pasuk yet, Shenemar Torasi, in the plural. Achas Torah B'chsavi, Achas Torah B'al Peh. Okay, wonderful. But that doesn't indicate that Avram Avinu was Makayim Erev Tavshilin. So again, if Yontif is on Erev Shabbos and you want to cook on Yontif for Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that. Ein Kodesh, Mechin LeKodesh. But if you set up an Erev Tavshilin before Shabbos, I should say before Yontif, I'd be more precise, then it's as if you started your process of preparing for Shabbos already on Erev Yontif and you just continue it. So that's the entity called Erev Tavshilin. So what's the emphasis here on Avram Avinu with regard to Erev Tavshilin? So he quotes here the footnote of Chassam Sofer, Shenokat Erev Tavshilin Lamdenu Shavosenu Nagu Shvisa B'Shabbos U'B'Moed. Right, the whole idea of an Erev Tavshilin is to be Makayim the Moed and allow us to cook for Shabbos without violating the Kedushas HaMoed. And now we want to prove that the Avos, that Avram Avinu was makabel on himself, not only mitzvos, but specifically mitzvos of the Moed. Why is Moedim? Again, the Chassam Sofer is moving us a little bit closer to the answer, but he doesn't really give us the whole answer. He's telling us that by virtue of Avram's fulfillment of Erev Tavshilin, it indicates the Shvisa of Shabbos and Moed. Well, Shabbos again, because you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. And Moed because you're not allowed to cook on Moed for the purpose of Shabbos. Okay, so we have in the Erev Tavshilin, we have in a sense, an overlap of Shabbos and Moed. So I'm going to take a stab at it. I don't know if this is what the Chassam Sofer has in mind, but you remember the pasuk Osi Beini U'Beinechem, that Shabbos, and for that matter Yontif as well, is called an os. Beini U'Beinechem, it indicates the intimate love between the Kala and the Dot, between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. The Havdalah Shivdilonu Mikol Amen, that this nation was separated from the other nations. And Avram Avinu is the father of a new nation. So it's very critical for Avram Avinu to emphasize in his transmission of Torah those dimensions of Torah which indicate, or shall I say, publicize the unique relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. And there's nothing better than Moedim for that. because Moedim are an os beini u'beinechem. That's what I would suggest. However, he quotes a Ritva. The Ritva says that mitzvah zu kalahi, kala with a kuf. Right, all you need is take a matzah and an egg, boiled egg. So it's relatively easy. So I don't get it. So why do we want to know? Oh, he's not talking about kala in the sense of how much effort you have to put in order to fulfill the mitzvah. I don't think that's what he means. Kala, I think here in this context, touches on the very essence of the mitzvah. In other words, all the other mitzvahs are inherently significant. And every mitzvah has its own implications or ramifications in the higher worlds. But then we have a different kind of a mitzvah, like Erev Tavshilin, which is called a mitzvah kala in this context. Just 1 second. I got it. If not for the Erev Tavshilin, if he starts baking, etc., on Yontif, on Friday Yontif for Shabbos, in a sense, he's forgetting about Yontif. He is downplaying Yontif. The purpose of the Erev Tavshilin is to upgrade the significance of Yontif in its mind. Again, it's not a kiyum in Yontif. Erev Tavshilin is only a matir that allows me to cook on Yontif for Shabbos. That's not going to give me a mitzvah which is in and of itself a yontiftika mitzvah. You follow what I mean? If I would give you a Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Yontif in Orach Chaim, everything that you'd see there is something that's related essentially to Yontif. And everything is meaningful in and of itself. So if I blow the shofar, that's a kiyum unto itself, shake a lulav, eat the matzah, etc. But there's a secondary kind of mitzvah within the constellation of Yontif, which is not inherently an observance of Yontif, but it uplifts the significance of Yontif in my mind. It's more of a phenomenological mitzvah, meaning it's all in the mind. So when I take an Erev Tavshilin, what I'm doing is I'm reminding myself of the significance of Yontif. That the only reason why I'm allowed to bake or cook on Yontif for Shabbos is because they were matir this through an Erev Tavshilin. And the Erev Tavshilin tells me that if I don't put down the Erev Tavshilin, I'm not allowed to cook on Yontif for Shabbos. The purpose of the Erev Tavshilin is not inherent. It's only a means to an end to remind you of the significance of Yontif, but it's not part and parcel of the observance of Yontif. So the emphasis here in Avram is that not only was he Makayim mitzvahs that are meaningful per se, in which each mitzvah inherently is a fulfillment of whatever that mitzvah is. Every mitzvah has its place in the picture of Taryag and its own unique niche, like the Evarim of the Guf. But then there's a mitzvah which is really meant just to arouse you to the significance of some other entity, some other mitzvah, so that the Erev Tavshilin is going to remind me of the significance of Yontif and how important it is to avoid desecrating the Yontif by doing malach on Yontif, which would be Shalol Litzorech Hayom. To do malach on Yontif, which is not for the purpose of Yontif, that in a sense is an insult to the Yontif itself. Oh, so I say to you, you know what? You're in a very pressing situation. You have to cook for Shabbos, but I want you to know and be aware of the fact that you are, in a sense, lowering Yontif by doing malach on Yontif for the purpose of Shabbos. How do I remind you of that? I'm going to say, stop. You're not allowed to cook on Yontif for Shabbos unless you make an Erev Tavshilin. The very fact that you need a matir to allow you to cook on Yontif conveys to you and transmits to you deep in your psyche the message that you don't tamper with Yontif. You need a matir in order to remove the iser of cooking on Yontif, in this case for the sake of Shabbos. Avraham Avinu is Mekayim, even a mitzvah that doesn't have any inherent significance, but rather it's a reminder to uplift your awe and generate a psychological attitude of the significance of a mitzvah. Then he writes, I'm not sure who he's quoting here, that with regard to Erev Tavshilin, Yechba Kula, again, the same idea of a Kula, that Avram was even makpid about something that like is a lightweight mitzvah. What makes Erev Tavshilin a lightweight mitzvah? Shemaspik kizayis echad l'choa omdim. Anyone who's going to enjoy the benefit and is within a certain circumference, a certain proximity, he's within the tchum of 2,000 amma, any such person can take advantage of this Erev Tavshilin, and he's allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. So that's a great kula, that when you put down an Erev Tavshilin, even other people who are not part of the Erev Tavshilin per se, but they're in close proximity, they can rely on the Erev Tavshilin. What did they do that deserves any sort of heter to allow them to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos? But this is indicative of the fact that there is a certain kula with regard to this area that expresses itself in the Erev Tavshilin. My friend Rabbi Yitzhak Shurin, I don't know if you know him, he tells the story that when he was in the army, in his unit, they considered him like the rabbi of the unit because he was the frum guy in the unit. So on one occasion, they were in tents, and it was Shabbos, and they forgot an Erev Tchumen, and there was a problem carrying from the ohel to the Chadar Ochel or back, whatever it was, because there was no Erev. So the Mefaked came over to Rabbi Shurin and says, okay, we don't have an Erev Tchumen, but can you make an Erev Tavshilin? He had no clue what an Erev Tavshilin was. They say about Shimon Peres that he once came into a high school class, in a regular high school in Israel. And he asked them, how far is it from Dan to Beersheba? So they said, Dan to Beersheba? We thought that they were husband and wife, like Sodom and Amorah. Okay. So there's a lot of ignorance which we have to overcome. In any event, the Gemara is emphasizing to what extent Avram Avinu was Mekayim the mitzvahs, whether it's Shama B'Koli, the Nisyonos that guard the tribulations and the tests, whether it was the Mishmarti, which is the siyagim of the Torah, whether it's chukosai, the statutes of the Torah that don't sound like they're sensible, and whether it's the mitzvah saseh or the mitzvah lo saseh, and even the drabanans, and even something like Erev Tavshili. And this leads us to Masya ben Shmuel, which is again going full swing back to our Mishnah about the earliest time to bring the carbon tamid in the morning, and to what extent is the horizon lit up. So that's where we're going to stop B'li Neder for today. Well, B'li Neder, I mean, we'll pick it up on Yom Sheni. I think Yom Rishon, we might not be able to continue our learning because we're going to be involved in a Sudas Purim. So I'll wish everyone a Freilich and Purim. Again, under the circumstances, there's a lot of fear out there, but we have to somehow gather together our sense of appreciation for the great miracles of Purim. I saw in a sefer that the miracle of Purim exceeds even Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's how great the miracle of Purim is. What would I pay for a cup of tea if I was allowed to drink it? I'm so dried out. Okay, Kol Tuv and Purim Sameach.